Hello, this is Brett Lonsdale from Lightning Tools. Welcome to the webinar this afternoon on SharePoint permissions and in particular our DeliverPoint product, which is used to manage permissions across both SharePoint on-premises and also SharePoint Online. So for those of you who don't know Lightning Tools or know me, we're just going to do a quick introduction and we'll set some expectations for the webinar, and then we're going to jump straight into the product, and obviously you're going to learn all about what DeliverPoint is and how it can hopefully help you manage your permissions inside your SharePoint environment. So first of all, like I said, welcome to the webinar. My name is Brett, and what I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about Lightning Tools. So we've been going for 11 years. We have our main headquarters in the UK, just outside of a place called Rugby. It's nice and sunny here in the UK. In fact, apparently a couple of days ago, we achieved warmer temperatures than Miami, Florida, which is not too far away from our other office, which is in Orlando, Florida. Hopefully nobody's going to take the mickey out of that. What we do as a company, we provide multiple products that fill gaps in SharePoint, and that ranges from permissions management, obviously, which you're going to see today, but also we have a number of other tools such as content aggregation or content or list rollup, as it may be known. We also have data visualization tools such as our chart product and the data viewer, and we've also got a form creator, so we can take any SharePoint list or library and modify the new form, edit form, and display form to add logic and change the layout of those forms. And we also have a discussion forum tool as well that provides enterprise discussion forum capabilities or discussion board capabilities to your SharePoint team sites. So that's what we do as a company. Our products are certified by a company called Rencor for best practices, and that's from our coding standards, but also from our bug reporting processes and internal processes around the writing of code. So we're very proud, obviously, to have achieved that for the last 3 years, and we're also a Microsoft Gold partner as well. Which of course we're also proud of as well. Myself, I'm a Microsoft MVP for Office servers and services. In the past, I've authored books. Not been doing too recently. I think most authors just can't keep up with the speed of Office 365 and how that's changing. So a lot of content is written online nowadays. Also, I'm one of the co-hosts of a pod show called Techsplaining. So if you haven't come across that yet, the website is techsplaining.net, and you'll be able to listen to some pod show recordings that we've been doing with other fellow MVPs, and also occasionally people from Microsoft as well, to get their opinions on perhaps things that are changing inside the Microsoft world as far as Office 365 and SharePoint are concerned. So the purpose of today is to look at how DeliverPoint can help with SharePoint permissions, and the focus is going to be really around some common pain points that we hear about from our customers. So the issues that they experience when trying to manage permissions inside of SharePoint, and then focusing on how DeliverPoint can overcome those pain points for your business users. And well, it might be business users, may also be for IT, meaning SharePoint administrators and site collection administrators, as well as in SharePoint on-premises, the business user being maybe somebody that just has full control or is a site owner. So we'll be taking a look at how that can work for you in SharePoint Online and also SharePoint on-premises. There will be time at the end for Q&A as well. So although obviously in a webinar everybody is muted, we'll provide is the opportunity for you to raise your hand towards the end of the webinar, which you should be able to familiarize yourself with in the GoToWebinar tool pane. You'll see the ability to raise your hand, and once that's done, I can unmute you and you can ask your question. So the only thing I'd ask is if you can make sure you do have a working microphone for that. If you do have any questions as well, but too shy to speak publicly on the webinar, then of course there will be the opportunity to email in your questions or perhaps arrange a call where we can go into a bit more depth on the product if that's something that you would like to do. So there'll be details of that at the end of the webinar. And also just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, will be available after the end of the webinar today, and yeah, you'll be able to find that on our website. So if you go to lightningtools.com, there is a webcast link, and that's where it will be as early as tomorrow morning. Okay, so the common pain points is the first thing we're going to look at. So these apply both to SharePoint on-premises and also SharePoint online. So it doesn't really matter which environment you're working with. You may have experienced some of these, and also whether you're an end user or maybe an administrator, you may have also experienced a lot of these as well. So one of them we hear a lot is about the share button. So obviously now, well, since SharePoint 2013, it seems not that long ago, but since SharePoint 2013, we have the share button that you will see inside your SharePoint team sites. You'll also see it inside your SharePoint lists and your SharePoint libraries. We'll also see it inside lists and document libraries against the folders and the items or the documents. And one of the frustrations is that the share button, it comes across like it was a social media tool. You're sharing this site with somebody else. But for me, the frustration is not so much the button itself, and that's just really another way of giving permissions to somebody. The frustration is that it's really not consistent when you're inside SharePoint. So, for example, if you click onto the share button when you're inside a SharePoint team site, clicking that share button doesn't affect the permission inheritance of the site itself. What it does do is, if the user that you're sharing the permissions with doesn't already have access to the team site, then they will be given permissions via the default group of that site. Now, unless you change that default group, the default group is going to be the members group for that particular team site. And by putting somebody in the members group, usually we'll give them edit permissions, unless, again, you've changed that. So the default, if we had a vanilla SharePoint environment, we click onto share, the user is going to go into the members group, and then we'll receive edit permissions. So one problem with that is people with edit permissions, first of all, have the ability to click share, and they can share the content as well. Another frustration is the fact that edit permissions is actually a very powerful permission level, which allows you as a user to go in and modify the lists and the libraries, which is useful from a point of view that you might be able to create more columns and so on, but it gives them the ability to also delete that list or library, which is concerning. So prior to SharePoint 2013, we still have the contribute permission level, but that's no longer the default group. The edit permission has replaced it as a default group. So that's one explanation of how the share button works at site level. A problem I have is the fact that it doesn't work consistently inside a list or a library. Now, somewhat this makes sense because we can take a document or a folder that lives inside a library, and we can share that as well. Now, if we share that document or share that folder, and again, the user doesn't already have permissions to it, then permission inheritance is broken at that point, unlike sharing the site, and a user is going to be given direct permissions to that document or folder. And that's one piece that is obviously intended, because if we put that user inside the members group like we would do at the site level, then of course that's giving them permissions to a whole bunch of things, whereas we actually want to focus in on the document and just give that user permissions to the one document. But that's not often understood, that it's got a different behavior to sharing at site level. And an issue with that is the fact that often this doesn't have any planning around it, and before you know it, we've got lots of documents or lots of folders with broken permission inheritance and direct permissions. And now, and the background to this slide will be explained, that what happens when that person leaves the organization, you're going to find that there's potentially thousands or tens of thousands of places where that user has direct permissions. And although when somebody leaves the organization, we just simply disable their Active Directory account so they can't authenticate, it does mean that there's going to be this confusion inside the organization when we go to check permissions on a document and find that somebody that perhaps left the organization a couple of years ago still has permissions to that document. And users will be seeing that in black and white and they'll question it. There's no easy way using SharePoint natively of simply removing those users from everywhere when they move on from the organization. So that's something that, I understand how Microsoft needed to design that, but we can work around it maybe with a bit of planning. Making sure that maybe we don't break permission inheritance as often with inside a library, so we could get around that by maybe having multiple libraries or working with folders more and creating more of an architecture. But in practice, that doesn't always happen. Document libraries are sometimes treated as a bit of a dumping ground, and permission inheritance is broken by the sharing of these items. So a user leaving a company really is trying to find a needle in a haystack looking for these permissions. Nobody's got the time to do that manually, to go and visit all of these documents, try and find out where they've been granted permissions. Another issue besides the share button is the reports. So we go into the site settings and look at the permission reports, and we see it from quite a high level. We see the permission report from people that have direct permissions to the site or to the item, and then we see the SharePoint group level. So we'll see our owners group, the members group, and the readers group. And if we click into those, then we start to see the members. But bear in mind that within inside a site collection, you're going to have way more than just those three groups, especially if you've got sites that have unique permissions and other groups have been created. The site collection becomes the scope of the SharePoint group. So you're going to have many SharePoint groups in there. And again, it's difficult to find the time to try and work out what permissions people have by visiting each of those different SharePoint groups. Now, I give you that you do have the check permissions button when you go into this report. So you can click the check permissions button, but you need to know who you're looking for. So I can say, I want to check the permissions of a particular person, say Jared Carter, and it will tell me what permissions Jared Carter has to that site. But what I can't do is say, well, tell me who's got permissions to this site exactly. I need to know every single user that has permissions to this site. To work that out, I have to go and visit every single SharePoint group. And nested inside of those SharePoint groups is sometimes Active Directory groups or Active Directory security groups. And even if you're in Office 365, you can also use the Office 365 groups nested inside the SharePoint groups as well. And that becomes difficult to actually view the membership then. So we've got not just nested groups, another layer that we have to drill into, but you can't drill into an Active Directory security group. So you have no idea as a business user who really has permissions to your team site. If they've been permissioned directly, or if they're directly a member of a SharePoint group, you can see what permissions they have given a bit of time, but you cannot be sure that they are the only people with permissions because you can't see the Active Directory security groups. So that's one challenge that we'll take a look at. Obviously, within an Office 365 SharePoint Online environment, we have external users as well to be concerned about. So what happens there when we share with an external user? Obviously, one of the things that happens, again, just like sharing a site in SharePoint on premises or sharing a SharePoint team site in SharePoint Online with a organization user, you're going to give them the default permission level or the default group. And again, that group may be used in other sites. So it's trying to determine, what have I just done by sharing my maybe sales team site with an external user? Have I given them permissions to other sites as well as a result of them now being a member of the sales team site? That same members group could be used in subsites where permissions are being inherited, or even subsites where permissions are now broken and that user is a member of that group still. That hasn't changed. So they are still given permissions to subsites throughout the environment as well. So permission inheritance, understanding where permission inheritance has been broken both at site level and item level, even list and library level is a challenge. You can see it, but you have to go and visit the permission page for every object. You get that yellow banner at the top that tells you whether the permission inheritance has been broken or not for the object. Again, at site level, you can go in and see, yeah, this particular user, this particular site has inherited permissions, and it does tell me what has been broken within inside that site, but then we have to navigate to it. And you have to do that at each site. DeliverPoint can overcome that quite nicely, which you'll see in just a moment. So users leaving an organization, we've already mentioned that. Think about what happens when a user does leave the organization. Well, quite often they are replaced. So what we can do there is take a user that is leaving, a user that's going to replace them, and then consider, well, this new person needs to have the same permissions that that old person had. So there's no bulk way of doing that inside of SharePoint. But again, that's something that DeliverPoint can take care of. We can simply transfer the permissions from one user to another, and select the scope that we want to do that at. And then also the other point to mention is SharePoint is very much designed around the business user. Business users create sites. This isn't like a traditional intranet that we had many years ago, which was created in HTML or ASP. So we have the ability as users to create our own sites and to be able to share those sites and to be able to grant permissions to those sites. And the management is done of the permissions via site owners and site collection administrators. When IT try to intervene with that, one of the problems is that they don't actually, that they're not working with inside that project themselves, and they don't have the understanding as to, well, who should really have permissions to this content, or who shouldn't have permissions to this content. That's something that's understood by the business user. And although there's also third-party tools that are available to manage permissions from an IT perspective, what DeliverPoint can provide is a tool to manage permissions within the context of SharePoint, and also it's aimed at the content owner. So the content owner can manage those permissions more effectively and report on those permissions as well. So these are the common pain points that we're going to be taking a look at. There's two versions currently of DeliverPoint. There is the full trust version designed around SharePoint on premises. We've also got the add-in version, which is designed around SharePoint Online. The SharePoint on premises version does have a few extra features than the online version and has the wider scope. So DeliverPoint for on premises can allow you to manage the permissions across the farm, and it's very much security trimmed, so you can go in and manage the permissions that you actually have full control to, or that you're the site collection administrator of, or you're the site owner of. It will trim out things that you don't have permissions to manage. The add-in is focused around the site collection administrator, and that site collection administrator can manage the permissions for the site collection. So there's a bit of a difference in the scope there between the two tools, although moving forwards, we're evolving the add-in version to the SharePoint framework as we speak. So that will be launched later on this year, and that is going to give you the same sort of capability of a tenant scoped report that you can execute. The reports, they both offer more detailed permission reports, and those permission reports are both content focused and account focused. So we can take a piece of content, whether it's a site, whether it's a list or a document or a folder, and see who has permissions to it. Or we can kind of reverse that and say, well, I have this user here, this user is going to be leaving the organization. I want to know what content that user has permissions to. So we can reverse that angle. Again, something that you can't easily do with SharePoint is focus in on that one account, either at site collection or farm scope within inside of SharePoint. There's the bulk permissions of bulk management of permissions that we can do in both versions. The on-premises version is currently the only one that has auditing and alerts, which we'll be taking a look at. So not only do we see who's got permissions now at this moment in time, but we can see how that person got permissions, i.e. who granted them permissions, when did they grant them permissions, and how did they grant them. Because sometimes when you're granting permissions, you don't intend for the results that can happen. I could, like I say, grant permissions at a team site called sales, not realizing that I'm also affecting all of these subsites that happen to share the same SharePoint groups as that parent site. So we might see an alert or part of an audit report that says Brett received permissions to channel sales and direct sales, and the sales manager saying, well, that shouldn't happen. How did that occur? And that's maybe because I needed permissions to the parent site sales, so somebody granted that to me. So we can tell throughout SharePoint who granted what and when, and also be alerted to that fact. So maybe we want to be alerted if somebody receives full control. So maybe it's okay, but let's just notify the site collection admin or notify the farm admin that somebody has just received full control to a team site. Maybe that's a concern, maybe it's not, but we can set up these rules that will notify us of things like that happening. So we can go through and take a look at it. Those two features, the auditing and the alerts, are not yet in the add-in. In fact, they won't be in the add-in. They're going to be in the SPFX version when that is launched later on this year. But that will be a capability that is available for SharePoint Online users as well. Both tools have dead account detection. What we mean by that is when somebody leaves the organization, the account is simply disabled or deleted from the Active Directory, but that person still is a member of SharePoint groups. They still have direct permissions, so they're going to show up inside the dead account detection report, and this then allows us to go through and remove that user so that they no longer show up inside the permission reports and therefore cause confusion. And the add-in version also has the external user permission reports as well, so we can see what permissions obviously external users have. So the rest of this webinar is effectively going to be demonstration. So let's go and have a look at those pain points and how DeliverPoint overcomes them. So we'll start off with who can see your content. And what I'm going to do is just jump into my SharePoint team site here. And in here, I'm working with the sales team of this Contoso team site. And what I'm going to do is just, first of all, jump into the site settings. So we're not using DeliverPoint at all at the moment. I'm just going to jump in and have a look at the out-of-the-box site permission report for that particular team site. And you can see here that there's 4 entries. They're all SharePoint groups. We've got a custom group called Contributors, which has contribute permissions. I've also got members, which has edit permissions. Then we've got owners, full control, visitors has read. And we have to drill into these SharePoint groups to view the members of that group. So notice that we've got Brett, we've got Amelia, we've got Van Hoosen-Koyer, and I've also got LT/sales. And LT/sales here is an Active Directory security group. So by clicking onto that, notice you can't drill into it. We can just see the account name, the claims name, and the friendly name for that Active Directory security group. We can't actually see any detail as to who might be a member of it. So maybe you've got a fantastic Active Directory administrator or OU administrator who keeps these up to date, but also there's organizations where they're not well kept up to date. So you want to be sure as the content owner that the right people are able to view your site. And of course, that same permission report goes for not just the site level, but also if we looked inside the documents as well. If we had a look at the document library, we can first of all be faced with numerous documents and not know where the permission inheritance is broken or not. And that can be another challenge which we'll have a look at. But let's first of all produce a DeliverPoint report. What I'm going to do here is click the Site Actions menu and come down to this report, the Discover Site Permissions. So this is what I meant by DeliverPoint is contextual. You don't have to be outside of SharePoint. You don't even have to go to another web application or site collection to see this. It's there inside the site. And if you just contrast this with those 4 entries that we saw inside the out-of-the-box team site permission report, with this report, we actually enumerate every single user that has permissions, and that user may appear multiple times if they've been granted permissions in more than one way. You'll see Amelia appearing more than once, you'll see Brett appearing more than once, and so on. And that's useful because if a user has already been granted permissions via an Active Directory security group and you can't see that using the native SharePoint reports, commonly you're going to go and add that user again, and you end up with duplicate permissions, which is exactly what's happened here. But with DeliverPoint, we can, within one click, see this report. That user's already been granted permissions. I know I don't need to grant that permission again. So we can see the users, we can see the permission level that they receive, and I can also see how they were permissioned as well. So if we take Amelia as an example, I can see that she has edit permissions, and if we expand the group on the right hand side here, in this particular case, she's directly a member of sales team members. But let's move down a little bit to Benjamin. He's inside the same group, but not directly. He's a member of the sales team members, but via the LT Sales Active Directory security group. So we can see exactly how people were permissioned, as well as seeing everybody that is permissioned. So if I determine that, well, Benjamin should not have access to this team site, now I'm armed with the ability to go and get him removed from that security group if he's not meant to be there, or even take away that security group from the team site as another decision. So we don't allow you as the user to be able to affect the membership of AD groups. Of course, that would be a bad practice, but you can obviously affect the membership of direct permissions or SharePoint groups, as long as you have the permission to do so. So we could select this row against Amelia and delete those permissions if we needed to, or also notice some of the other operations like transferring permissions and granting permissions and so on that I can perform, which we'll come on to in just a moment. These reports can be filtered as well. So notice you've got the filter icon at the top there. So we can filter on the permission level. We can filter on how they were permissioned or on the username. So if I wanted to see everybody that has maybe contribute permissions to this particular site, we can set that in place. And there's our report. So there's actually just 2 users that have been granted contributor permissions, and we can see how that's occurred at the top there. So that's reporting on a single site. Shortly, I'll show you how we can report on multiple sites in one report as well, even if they're in different site collections and so on. So we'll come on to that. What I'd like to move across to is a document library. So here inside the document library, I'm sure your document libraries don't just have a handful of Word documents and a couple of folders. But even in this environment, I'm not going to perform these 7 clicks, which I have to perform. And it's 7 clicks if you know where you're going. So as we click onto to shared with, we have to wait for this little spinny to come back. Which you can see is not that responsive. And we get this initial view of seeing who this document has been shared with, but that doesn't enumerate the AD groups obviously either. When we click onto advanced, that's when we actually get to see whether the document itself has unique permissions or not, or whether it's inheriting. So again, you saw how long that took. That's not something that you probably have time to do inside your environments. So what we can do with DeliverPoint is come up to the DeliverPoint ribbon in the menu here, and there's a unique items button, which if we click onto that, that's going to go through that document library and tell me exactly what has broken permission inheritance. So there's actually 3 objects. There's the salesperson commission sheets, there's Word document 7 and Word document 8. They both have unique permissions. So now going back to that document library, we can just simply report on multiple items here. I can take the folder, the 2 documents, and run a discover permissions report on all 3 of those items at the same time. And now we can start to filter on those items. So by username, if I want to focus in on Rio as an example, we'll hit save. And there we go. We can see that she has edit permissions to all 3 of those objects. And once more, I can determine how she has permissions to those objects. So that's something that we can do with inside the site. We can also export these reports out to an Excel spreadsheet. We can also schedule them. So if I wanted this report to be automatically produced every month, so it's just something that's maybe part of a monthly meeting that we check who's got permissions on certain content, we can produce that in the form of an Excel document, and obviously we can use that to check on those permissions. Now, there's also the main deliver point page that we're going to navigate to. What we've seen so far is the contextual stuff, but as we go to this main deliver point page, we see a security trimmed view of the entire farm in this case. So that's obviously in SharePoint on-prem. As I mentioned, if we go to SharePoint Online, we can go through and access the add-in version of Deliver Point, and it gives me the same view of the content. The only difference is that the add-in version is scoped to the site collection, but we get the same features bar that auditing and alerts. So notice you've got the site collection scoped here. We can still drill down, see our lists and libraries and our sites and so on, just like we do here in SharePoint on-prem. So SharePoint on-prem, as we drill down, we can see the site's managed path. We can see all of our site collections. So as we drill into the Contoso site collection, I can see all of the different subsites that make up that environment and so on. And I want to bring your attention to the tree view itself, because that gives a way where the permission inheritance is broken or inherited. Excuse me. So the top level site, of course, has unique permissions, obviously, but as we look inside that site collection, I can see that accounts, business data, and the content aggregation or research and development, they all have inherited permissions, whereas human resources and the sales team site have unique permissions. And I can tell that just simply by looking at the tree view. So obviously, the human resources and sales team, they have that full color icon, which is giving the game away, the fact that they have unique permissions. Now notice that the sales team and human resources also have a diagonal strike through. And what that's telling me is that within inside the site, there's broken permission inheritance. So as I expand that sales team site, we'll see the channel sales and direct sales. Channel sales has inherited permissions. Direct sales has unique permissions. Nothing inside channel sales or direct sales has broken permission inheritance. Otherwise, we would see the diagonal line again. But the sales team site did, and we can see where that permission inheritance was broken. It's inside the document library, because the document library itself is inheriting permissions, but because the document library has that diagonal line, I can tell that there's actually broken permission inheritance within that document library. So we're actually saving you a lot of time here in where to actually spend your time looking at the permission reports. You don't have to go and look at accounts, business data, content aggregation, or research and development. They're all inheriting permissions. Human resources, yet we can tell it's got unique permissions, and we can see that something inside that site has unique permissions as well. But you don't have to spend all this time trying to figure it out, because we're telling you exactly what's got broken permission inheritance. And when we click onto view folders from that document library, notice I can tell exactly what has broken permission inheritance. It's that salesperson commission sheets folder that has unique permissions. We can tell that because, again, the folder is in full color. So with that in mind, we can actually report directly on these things. So I can maybe take the sales team site, because it has unique permissions, and notice that also direct sales has unique permissions. So my next question is, why? Why does direct sales have different permissions to the sales team site? So what I can do here is actually compare the permissions of those two team sites. So now I get this matrix report, which highlights the differences, and as you can see, there are no differences. They are exactly the same, which means that permission inheritance has been broken on one of the sites unnecessarily. It's actually got exactly the same permissions as the sales team. But yeah, let's add a few other sites into the mix. I'll bring in human resources. We'll compare permissions. And now we can actually start to see some differences. In fact, there was just one difference in this case. So there's somebody, Naya Goldammer, who doesn't actually have any permissions at all to the human resources site, but does to the 2 sales related team sites. And again, this report can be exported out to Excel. So that saves you quite a bit of time in being able to determine what the differences are and whether the sites can re-inherit their permissions, which is something I could do. I can just simply leave the direct sales team site selected, and we can go up to the permission inheritance button here on the ribbon and click onto inherit permissions, and that will re-inherit the permissions from the parent object. So that will now, if we refresh this page, show that is as inherited for me. So as we once again drill into sites, we will drill into Contoso, drill into that site collection, drill into sales team, and we can see direct sales there is now inheriting permissions. Okay, so from here we can also produce the same permission report that you saw before, so we can discover permissions on a site or also multiple sites, just like we did with the document library. So we can go through and select those from the tree view. We've also got another report, which is the account centric report. So like I say, all these are looking at who's got permissions to a particular object, but we can go through to the account centric view. And let's say we do have somebody that's going to potentially leave the organization. I can do a search on any part of that person's name. So that returns for me that account. We can select that account and we can click onto unique permissions. And this isn't going to show me everything they have permissions to. It's going to show me everywhere where they've been granted permissions. What we can see here is, first of all the different account memberships. So I can see what groups that user is a member of. This would also show Active Directory groups if that user is a member of an Active Directory group as well. I've also got the fact that this user is a site collection admin. That's really good information, because if I go through and delete a site collection, if I go through and delete this user, I'm basically going to orphan a site collection. So that site collection could end up without a site collection administrator in that case. So we actually cover that in deliver points, so that can't happen, but even so, it's good information to see that this user is a site collection admin before you go ahead and delete him. We've also got the site permissions, or the list permissions, and all the way down to item permissions. So I can see what that user has been granted permissions to, how they've been permissioned, so whether it's through the everyone group, like many of these, whether it's through a SharePoint group, and also what that permission level is. And these are all hyperlinks. So if I saw something that isn't quite right, I can just go through and click onto the permission level and change it. So I don't have to go and do anything special. I can just simply go through and change that permission directly from that page there. Okay, so that's a little bit of the reporting, and hopefully what you can see is how the reports give you much better visibility as to who's got permissions to your content. So you don't have to go drilling into the different SharePoint groups. You can enumerate the Active Directory groups. We can see who's members of them. It also includes implicit permissions. So if people have been granted permissions via the fact that they're a site collection admin or something like that, that's also included. And in Office 365, we also include the external users as well. So if I go to the Office 365 site and click onto I have a site called Deliver Point Permissions. What I can do is click onto Discover User Permissions. So that's going to enumerate everybody that's got permissions to this particular site. And this works in the same way. So in here, I can see, again, how people were permissioned. So notice how Joseph here, he's a member of the visitors group, not directly, but via an Active Directory security group. But maybe one of these users is an external user. So I can go to the external users view, and in there I can see that Alan Lonsdale is an external user. So if we go through and perform that account-centric view, let's paste in Alan Lonsdale here into that report, select it, and run the unique permissions report. I can see what that user has permissions to. And we can see that he's permissioned against a few sites. So we have customer demonstration, deliver point permissions, Lightning Form, Social Squared, etc. So all these different sites, I can see what permission level he has and which groups he's a member of and how that permission was granted, whether it was direct or through one of these SharePoint groups. So like I say, if you grant permissions to Alan Lonsdale on customer demonstration, it's possible that he also gained permissions to these other sites. The fact that they are also using that the members group that the customer demonstration site was using. Okay, so better reports. What about when a user leaves the organization? So like I said, when a user usually leaves the organization, what should happen is we take away their direct permissions, we take away their SharePoint group memberships, we disable them inside the Active Directory, and we take them out of the Active Directory groups. In practice, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes the account is just simply disabled inside the Active Directory group. And when that occurs, like I say, it can lead to some confusion. The user is now effectively a dead account, but they're still going to show inside the permission reports. So when we're inside SharePoint and we go to Deliver Point, I can run this from a site collection scope in online or site collection or web application or even farm scope in on-prem. We execute the dead account report and that will show me the site collection that's affected and the user account that is a dead account. So this account is actually just disabled inside the Active Directory. I could re-enable that account, but he is disabled inside the Active Directory. And I've got some other information such as, is he a site auditor? Is he a site admin? Does he appear in any groups, etc.? So that's giving me that information as well. But if I want to, I can just simply say, well, this user is long gone. He shouldn't be showing up inside any permission reports at all. I need to remove him. And just to show you that we can use that in conjunction with the account-centric view. So even though he can't authenticate, when we do a search on that user, if we select that account and we run the unique permissions report, there we go. He's still in SharePoint groups. He's still got site permissions, list permissions, and item permissions. Yet he's a disabled account inside the Active Directory. So with that in mind, we can just simply go through and say, well, he shouldn't appear in these AD groups, but now I can report to the AD administrator which groups he's a member of, and also I can delete him from all the SharePoint groups and all the direct permissions in one click. So we can just simply select this account, go to the report menu, and then delete that account, and that will all be taken care of. So that's something that we can also do. Is keep the dead accounts clean. We've also got the ability to copy or transfer permissions should somebody be leaving. So if we think about the processes that take place when somebody does leave the organization, typically if they're leaving and we've found a replacement, that replacement user may work alongside them to do a handover, in which case one of the things we might want to do is copy the permissions from the person that's leaving to the person that's replacing them. And we can choose what scope we want to do that at. So in here, we might just want to execute that on a particular team site or a particular project, or we could do it at the entire site collection or entire web application, whatever we want to do. So we select our scope on the left here, and at the top, we could either do a copy permissions, which means the person that we're copying permissions from will retain their permissions, or we could transfer the permissions, meaning the person we're copying from loses their permissions and then they are granted to the new user. So those are very similar operations, but that's the only difference, is whether the source account retains their permissions or not. So in here, if I just simply put in a user, let's put in Amelia, and we'll transfer her permissions to Rio, and we can choose when that executes. So I'll just hit next and OK. That's just verifying that I want that job to take place. And now we get to see the job status. So the job status is currently pending. This is because it's a timer job that executes that every 5 minutes. So within 5 minutes at the site collection scope, the permissions that Amelia had are going to be transferred to Rio, so she'll receive those. Now, one of the things whilst we're waiting for that we can do is also jump into some of these jobs and actually have a look at what happened as a result of it. So this was just simply a grant permission, so I can see that the permissions were granted. We can see who executed that, when it was executed, and whether it's successful or not. One of the other things we can do is actually roll back that job if we want to, and you can see that this one has been rolled back, so it has the rollback completed. So in other words, if I maybe selected the wrong Rio or something like that, I want to put the permissions back to Amelia, then we can reverse the operation, and that will take place. Whilst a job is still pending, we can also cancel it. So obviously it hasn't taken place yet, so I can stop that from occurring. There's advanced options here as well. So this report won't go on forever. You can basically just specify a window that you want to look at. So jobs that were created after a certain date. So we'll come back to that, and we'll have a look at that operation. Whilst we're also here in Deliver Point, let's have a look at a few other things. So we have the ability to, like I say, transfer permissions. I can grant permissions as well. And one of the things that I have the ability to do whilst granting permissions, how many of you have granted permissions to somebody and then forgotten that you did it? So maybe you need to give somebody permissions for a certain amount of time so that they can perform an operation of some sort, maybe change a list or something like that. So what we can do here is give somebody permissions. So we choose the account, we choose the permission level that we want to give them, or the group that we want to make them a member of, but then we can actually specify in minutes how long we want to do that for. So if it's just simply to do an operation, to go and add a new column to a list, we say, yeah, here you go, you've got design permissions for 10 minutes, go do it. And then it will automatically be revoked after that 10-minute period. Or maybe you've got a contractor, you can give them permissions for a month or something like that, or whatever they need, and then the permissions will be revoked after that time. We can also go through and revoke permissions manually. This is different to delete permissions. Delete permissions will delete all permissions that a user has. Revoke permissions will take a permission level away. So maybe the user already has contribute permissions, and that's what they should have. I temporarily need to give them edit permissions, so I do, and then I can go and revoke the edit permission by coming in and specifying that that's the permission level I want to remove from that particular account. So that's another nice feature that we have here in Deliver Point. So you can, like I say, copy, transfer, grant. We can also delete permissions and view those dead account reports. The other operations that you can perform include copying entire permission sets, the entire ACL, between objects. So maybe this, let's go through and select a site here. So I'll select the sales team site, and we'll say copy site permissions. So the sales team site becomes the source. And what I can do is go through and select the target sites. So I've created a new site somewhere, and I want it to have the same permissions as the sales team site. And that can even be in a different site collection. So as we go through and expand, let's say doesn't make sense, but let's say I want human resources to have the same permissions as a sales team site. We could do that, and we can choose when we want it to run again. And if the site is in another site collection, because SharePoint groups and custom permission levels are scoped at site collection level, I can clone those. So we can go through and clone any custom permission levels or clone the SharePoint groups to the other site as well. In this case, that's not applicable because they're inside the same site collection, so it will just simply use the same groups and the same custom permission levels. So I'll deselect those, but yeah, we can hit next and OK, and that will again be a scheduled job to go through and clone the permissions between those two sites. So as we go through and look at the job status again, I can see that that is currently pending. Our other job, transferring permissions between Amelia and Rio, is completed. So I can go through and view that job, see what took place as a result. So in here you can see all the permissions that were affected inside that scope, and yeah, the ability to roll back is there as well. So dealing with bulk permission management, granting permissions, deleting permissions, copying, transferring permissions are things that we can do in bulk. You just simply have to select whatever the scope is on the tree view here. So yeah, we could affect multiple sites, or anything inside a site collection, or anything inside a web application, or even farm for that matter. Okay, so that's useful. Cloning objects, we just talked about that. Yeah, if you're dealing with personnel changes, or need to replicate the permission levels between sites or lists or list items, you can do so. The alerts. So let's have a look at alerts. So through this feature, we can keep track of changes that are taking place with permissions specifically. Just to clarify, what this is not is it's not usage monitoring, it's permission monitoring. So what we can do is just go through and have a look at perhaps a site collection again. So I'm going to choose the Contoso site collection, and what I want to know is what's changed. So I can first of all click onto the audit permissions. Okay, and in here I get to see three groups of things. I've got permission changes. If we just collapse that for a moment, I've got permission inheritance changes, and if we collapse that for a moment, we've got group membership changes as well. So permission changes, you'll notice that first of all you've got the red or the green icon. So a green icon is somebody's received permissions, the red icon is somebody's had their permissions removed. So that's actually, since that's the human resources site and it's only just occurred, that's due to the operation that I just executed. So we can see when that job executed, who initiated the job, at what scope did they do it, and again, who was affected and what was affected. So this kind of proves what I said earlier on, that by performing something at one site can affect many sites as well. So you've got the scope that we could perform something on, but it actually affects multiple things. So in here we can see making a change at the direct sales team site affected CRM1, CRM2, CRM3, and CRM4 team sites, as well as the Lightning Forms team site, and so on. So one change affected a whole bunch of sites, which we can see from this what actually the result was. So the permission inheritance change, if somebody changes the inheritance, we'll see that. Again, see who changed it, and also the group membership changes. So as people are added or removed from groups, and quite clearly, I just transferred permissions from Rio to Amelia, or the other way around. So Amelia's had her permissions removed, Rio's received those permissions. And this isn't just if you perform that operation through DeliverPoint. If you did this in SharePoint natively, if I granted permissions to somebody in SharePoint or clicked the share button, this is going to track that change as well. Or even if you used PowerShell to perform that change, it will also track that. So it literally is just looking at any permission change that you perform. And we can change the scope of this report as well. If we want to see less detail, we could focus in on a particular day. Now, rather than viewing the report and having a look at what's changed, we can also be notified of the change as it happens. So I can click onto the Alert Me and create a new alert, which is in the form of a rule. So I can set this at site collection level, or more granular than that, I could set it up on a list or even on a site. We can give it a title. So the title I want to give this is someone got full control to Contoso. Okay, so maybe I just want to keep track of that fact. I don't want to block it. I don't want to stop it from happening, but I just want to be told that somebody's been given full control, and then we can have a look at whether that's legitimate or not. So who do I want to send the alerts to? So we can choose the account that we want to notify. What do I want to monitor? So I can monitor all permission changes, just inheritance changes, group membership changes, or deleted users or groups. And then we can refine the rule by who the initiator was, the permission level, or the member, the person that it affected. So if we wanted to, we could actually have a report here that says, if Jared goes and changes anybody's permissions, tell me. Or if anybody in this OU goes and changes any permissions, tell me. Or we can have, obviously, as I just talked about, a permission level. So we'll put full control. So anybody that receives full control, it's going to notify me of that. Or a member name pattern. So we could be informed of certain users being granted permission. So if this user is given permissions to something inside of our site collection, then we're going to be alerted about that. And we can choose whether we want to be notified immediately, daily, or weekly as a digest. So we can just simply create that rule, and it will start to monitor that, and now will notify me should that occur. Okay, so yeah, there's obviously the alerts as well. So being able to see who's assigning permissions, who's receiving permissions, who received a specific permission level, we can check for all of those things. Just something that I didn't mention in slides before we come onto this roadmap is also through DeliverPoint, the on-premise version. Although this is security trimmed, and so anybody that is I was logged in as the farm admin here, but if I logged in as Brett, then I would see this tree view from Brett's perspective. I'm going to be able to manage the permissions on things that I have obviously the rights to manage permissions on. There is a problem with that let's say you've got a help desk inside your organization, and help desk users can report and manage permissions. You have to give them full control to be able to do this, and that means that they can obviously delete content, they can view content that maybe isn't for them to see. So what DeliverPoint allows you to do is also go in, and I'll zoom in on this in just a moment. So you can also set up operators and auditors. So anybody that is a auditor can use DeliverPoint throughout the farm in this case, but they can only produce permission reports from a read-only perspective. That allows maybe your help desk to be able to produce permission reports without even having access to go and view documents or view the site themselves. They can just see who's got permissions to a particular site. The operator account it gets far more control. You're actually giving them the ability to manage permissions on anything using DeliverPoint. So useful maybe for your IT team, your SharePoint administrators and so on that are logging on without logging in as the farm admin. You can give them the ability to manage permissions, but again, you don't. Maybe there's content that lives inside the human resources team site that they should not be able to see themselves. So yeah, you're basically giving them the ability to manage permissions, but they can't necessarily view the content of what they're managing permissions on. So just a couple of things inside the roadmap. This year, obviously, we're going to see the release of 2019. So we're preparing a 2019 build, but we're also very busy on the SharePoint Online iteration of taking the add-in to the SharePoint framework. So this has actually been taking place for the last 12 months. And that's going to give us far better control. It's going to give us the ability to crawl and cache information about permission reports, which means we can produce reporting across site collections, and we're not limited to a single site collection like we are in the add-in model. So you'll be able to produce tenant scoped reporting just like we do inside on-prem. There'll be scheduled permission reporting, which you don't get in the online version currently, and also support for modern sites. So you can currently go into a modern list or a modern library, and the add-in will give you the buttons to produce the permission reports. But obviously, it's very ribbon driven inside a site, so we'll be changing that inside through the SharePoint framework model to work with the modern sites as well. There'll be customizable reports, so you can tweak them, and we'll also have the alerts, auditing, and a default group setting as well, appearing in both versions, the on-prem and the online. So that's the roadmap for the rest of the year. What next? So it's very difficult to be able to demonstrate this entire product in just 1 hour. So what you can do is, if you want to have a more detailed demonstration, there's a link there, or a URL there. So if you go to lightningtools.com/demonstration-request, you can fill that form out, and that will allow you to request a demo, a private demo. You can also get a 14-day trial. There's a QR code there that will take you straight to the site, so you can download DeliverPoint. If you need more than 14 days to trial it, that's not a problem. We can manage that. If you have any questions, I'm going to open up for a QA session here in just a moment. And also, you can email me on brett@lightningtools.com if you also have any questions. If you want to be alerted to changes in DeliverPoint when these new releases come out, I'd suggest you sign up for our newsletter. So with the recent GDPR changes, you may have been removed if you didn't act on our emails. So make sure you're signed up so you can be notified of new releases and so on. And also bear in mind, next week we're also doing another webinar on another one of our products, which is the content roll-up tool, the Lightning Conductor. So you look out for a newsletter next week, which is going to have a link so you can register for that webinar as well. So I'm going to open up for questions. So if you do have any questions, just raise your hand. And like I said, I'll unmute you. You can ask a question. Or if you don't want to do that, feel free to just email me on brett@lightningtools.com. Okay, I'm not seeing any raised hands. All right, I'm going to make the assumption there are no questions. So that said, if you do think of any, feel free to email me. I'll be more than happy to reply to your email there, or obviously get in touch with your account manager if you have one, and they'll be able to help you as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the webinar, and hopefully I will see you again on the next week, where we talk about the Lightning Conductor and rolling up content.